Good
Yeah.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences Book Talk series. We're now in what I think is our third year of this series, and delighted this afternoon to welcome Dr. Rebecca Bratspace. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Close, Bratsby's good enough.
Bratspace, okay. So this is Dr. Rebecca Bratspace. Dr. Bratspace is a professor of law at the City University of New York Law School, where she's the founding director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform and an internationally recognized expert on environmental justice. Her text, Environmental Justice, Law Policy and Regulation, is used in law schools all across the country. And while she's been promoting environmental justice as an international expert among her peers, she's also brought education about environmental justice to a new generation of global citizens through her widely known and award-winning series of graphic novels that she's worked on with the author Charlie LaGreca Velasco, who does the images. Some of them include Maya's Lot and Bina's Plant. They won the EPA 2023 Clean Air Excellence Award. And she's even got a coloring book for the youngest of our new global citizens. I'm thinking of buying one for my granddaughter called We All Count. She's published extensively in a number of professional journals, including the Michigan Telecommunications and Technology Law Review. She's done research papers for many of the law schools across the country, and she's worked in so many various areas. But she's here today to talk to us about a book that takes her multifaceted work in a completely new direction, naming Gotham, the villains, rogues, and heroes behind New York's place names, new from Arcadia Publishing. So, Dr. Brightspace, please join us and tell us all about your book.
Thank you. And thank you for that generous introduction. I mean, really, it's a very polite way of saying that I don't know how to stay in my lane. So I'm, as you said, I'm a law professor. I'm just going to share my screen so that I can show you some pretty pictures while we talk, if I can get this to work. And sorry, having technology issues today, because of course I am. So I started this book quite a while ago. It is and the cat, of course, is joining me. Sorry about this. Okay, so are you seeing my slideshow or not? No, huh? Okay, try it again.
Not yet. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I see a few of my students there. They will tell you I'm usually better than this with the technology. Okay, so I tend to write about protecting the environment with a focus on environmental justice and human rights. And more I've been writing about New York City and about how we make decisions here about infrastructure and how the benefits and burdens of that infrastructure impacts different communities across the city. I'm also a longtime Astoria resident with a brief stint in Greenwich Village. And this book really took me out of my comfort zone. I'm not a historian, but it's also at the heart of my work, because doing this research transformed the way that I think about the city, and it added a layer of historical analysis to the policy work that I do. So this is a project that began in traffic and in congestion. My parents live in Pennsylvania, and as I said, I live in Astoria. So my husband and I used to take the Major Deegan Expressway to the George Washington Bridge on a regular basis. And we were always stuck in traffic. These are just two of the probably 3,000 photographs I have that are exactly like this. Especially at the place where the Major Deegan and the Cross Bronx merge together, when you're either getting on or getting off the George Washington Bridge. This part of the Major Deegan Expressway has been named the worst road in New York City by AAA. And anyway, I am not very good in traffic. I get very cranky. Bad words maybe come out of my mouth. And I would always curse Major Deegan. And then I would wonder, who the hell was this guy anyway? And my family got sort of sick of hearing me say that. And eventually they just said, well, why don't you find out? And so I did. And it turned out that Major Deegan is way less impressive than you might expect, given that the road that goes by Yankee Stadium to the George Washington Bridge bears his name. And that sort of got me wondering, well, who was Bruckner? Who was Sheridan? Who was Kosciuszko? Who was Hutchinson? Who were all these people? Because we tend to forget that these names that have really become words, right? They've become synonyms for congestion in New York, are actual people. And the more I learned, the more interested I got. And I couldn't get away from the fact that the Major Deegan was one of the most heavily traveled roads in New York, and nobody knew who the guy was. And so that was really the genesis of this book. And one of the challenges that I faced is that just about all the people in this book could have been their own book rather than a chapter in a book. And some of them, like LaGuardia or Stuyvesant, have multiple books written about them. But a lot of the others are pretty obscure. And so when I had to pick and choose, I tried to pick the more obscure, gossipy people to write about. So let's start with the origin story. Who was Major Deegan? Who was that Major Deegan anyway was the working title for the book. The publisher rejected it immediately, saying, yeah, that's not going to work because everyone will think this is just a biography of Major Deegan, which, okay, fair point. So, you know, one of the interesting things I found is that a lot of people in New York don't realize that actually Major Deegan was a person. They see Madge Deegan and they think, well, you know, maybe there's a minor Deegan somewhere, or what is Madge anyway? But those who do just sort of assume that Major Deegan was some kind of a war hero. He wasn't. Or maybe he was a soldier who died leading troops in battle. He didn't. In fact, it's sort of hard to figure out what Major Deegan did to rate having a road named after him, except die young and have a lot of powerful friends. He was an architect. He studied at Cooper Union. I'm going to talk about Peter Cooper in a couple of minutes. And during World War I, he was a major in the Army Corps of Engineers. In that capacity, he spent the war here in New York. He never set foot on European soil, even though he was technically part of the American Expeditionary Force. He designed fortifications for the Army Corps under the command of General George Washington Goethals, who's also in the book. The Goethals Bridge is named after him. And, you know, like, that's valuable work. And Deegan probably did it pretty well, but it's hardly the stuff of legend. And even his supporters acknowledge, well, you know, like he wasn't Teddy Roosevelt or anything. But interestingly, in 1999, when Governor Pataki proposed renaming the Major Deegan Expressway for Joe DiMaggio, because, you know, it goes right by Yankee Stadium, man, did that raise an uproar. And veterans groups came out of the woodworks to object to renaming the road. And probably the most important thing that Deegan did was to help form the American Legion right after World War I. He was commander of the New York branch, and he really was, in that role, a strong advocate for returning soldiers. He did battle with the Veterans Administration over the lack of adequate medical care. He was a big supporter of the bonus army. And then he ran to be chair of the American Legion, the national chair. And his campaign platform was that the Veterans Bureau should immediately fire all married women and give their jobs to war widows. And strangely enough, that wasn't the most compelling platform. The Veterans Administration, or the Veterans Bureau, maybe smarting from the fact that he had sort of tangled with them pretty successfully, they started a whisper campaign against him at the National Convention, saying, hey, this guy didn't actually serve overseas, you shouldn't elect him. And even though he went in as the significant favorite and was expected to win, he wound up losing to a guy from Texas who had served overseas. After that, he entered politics. And he had a stint as in the Bronx as the Chamber of Commerce chair. And then his best buddy, Mayor Jimmy Walker, appointed him to be the tenement commissioner. And as an architect, he was actually well qualified to be tenement commissioner, and it's akin to today's housing commissioner. As tenement commissioner, Deegan was tasked with enforcing the laws for safety in housing. New York had doubled and tripled in population in a very short period of time. And as a result, the housing stock was really inadequate. And people had figured out that some absentee landlords had figured out that they could make a lot of money renting to those new immigrants, even though a lot of them were desperately poor, by opting for density. And the tenement commission, the tenement laws and then the tenement commissioner were an attempt to reverse that and to have some basic sanitary standards in terms of light, in terms of air, in terms of ingress and egress, and basic safety. So the tenement laws are what get us. You have to have a window in a bedroom that get us. You have to have lights in the hallway, that there has to be a way out of the buildings. And that's what was Deegan's job, to enforce that. And as tenement commissioner, Deegan took the important public stand against pigeon coops. That was like his issue. He was convinced that pigeon coops, first of all, were a fire hazard, which they probably were, but he also was convinced that pigeons spread polio, which they don't. But he banned pigeon coops from the top of buildings and was then besieged by pigeon fanciers, of whom there were quite a few in the city. And these outraged pigeon fanciers lobbied him to change his mind, emphasizing the central role that pigeons play in war readiness. So he didn't buy that argument. But he did very kindly say that pigeons would still be allowed in the city's parks. Mayor Walker also appointed Deegan chairman of the Mayor's Committee for the Reception of Distinguished Guests. And in just 2 short years in that post, Deegan managed to rack up $5,000 in bills for flowers, lunches, and cars, which is like $85,000 in today's money. One thing I should say about him that I think is important in both his role as tenement commissioner and his role in the American Legion is he was a voice for Black returning servicemen. He made a number of speeches saying that Black servicemen should be welcomed into the American Legion. Now, mind you, into segregated posts. There was a William Lloyd Garrison post in Harlem, and he really encouraged Black service members to join that post rather than other posts. But he also really emphasized that they should have the same access to services that white veterans were getting. And that's, a pretty impressive position, I think, to have taken back then. Same thing as tenement commissioner. He made sure that in enforcing the laws, he was enforcing them for Black tenants as well as for white tenants. And in fact, he was after his death, he was lauded in the Black press for those stands that he'd taken. He died young. He was only in his 40s. He died from the complications of appendicitis. And by all accounts, he was a really nice guy with a lot of powerful friends. His funeral was a full-bore military affair. Thousands of people marched up Fifth Avenue behind the coffin. There were military bands, airplanes did a flyover, and his pallbearers included 2 US senators and a legion of New York dignitaries. And soon afterwards, the approach road to the Triborough Bridge was renamed in his honor. And when it eventually became an expressway under the auspices of Robert Moses, it was still named after him. So that's sort of the origin story. And I just wanted to show you, this is the front piece of the book. It's a map that was made by my artist partner that I do the comic books with, Charlie LaGreca Velasco. And it shows you sort of all of the people and all of the infrastructure that is discussed in the book. And I think it's really beautiful. So I always try to share it whenever I can. And so what I'm going to do pretty briefly over the next couple of minutes is to sort of walk you through the idea of who I chose to research and how. I have to be clear that the people who are in this book, it's not at all intellectually defensible. It really was who caught my interest, and then I ran out of space. I had a lot of people that I would have loved to write about, including Jacob Javits and Alexander McDougall, but I just ran out of space. It turns out that when you're writing a popular press book as opposed to an academic press book, when they give you a word limit, they actually mean it. So I had to stop. So I tried to pick like the more obscure people, as I said, and I also tried to pick people who had interesting stories. Like I didn't pick Jonas Bronk, even though the Bronx is named after him, because there's the historical record is really thin, and he just sort of lived there for a couple of years and owned some land. There are a lot of fun facts in the book, though, and there's just so much trivia about New York. I'll just give you a couple of examples, and like the Outer Bridge crossing. I mean, most people in New York just assume it's called the Outer Bridge because it's the outermost bridge, but it's actually named after Eugenius Outer Bridge, and that's why it's called a crossing, because Outer Bridge bridge would sound a little odd. And he was the first president of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And it was really due to his work that we have a Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And Gertrude Whitney, right, founder of the Whitney Museum, among other things. Not only was she a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor, but she also was on the National Dairy Association's honor roll. So like there are all kinds of interesting things. So I'm going to tell you about the some of the heroes first, and then I'm going to go through the book's called The Heroes, Rogues, and Villains Behind New York Place Names. So really quickly, couple of the heroes. First, Peter Cooper. He's one of my favorites. I'm a little bit of a Peter Cooper fangirl. He invented many things, including Jell-O. He had 1 year of formal schooling, and he wound up making multiple fortunes in multiple industries. He made a lot of money in iron, in railroads. He helped found AT&T. His first fortune he made was in glue, and in fact, his factories were so polluting that they were banned in Brooklyn, and he was forced to move them to Newtown, and the Newtown Creek area. And when Queens and Brooklyn joined with Manhattan to form the city of Greater New York, the town that had been known as Newtown changed its name to Elmhurst because it didn't want to be associated with the polluted Newtown Creek. And so, good and bad. But Peter Cooper was an ardent abolitionist. And he also, even though he only had 1 year of formal education, he was a passionate advocate for education. And he started Cooper Union, it was called the Cooper Institute at the time, as a place where people could get free education. And it was from its beginning open to everyone, unlike many institutes of higher learning. And when Lincoln came to New York to speak at the Cooper Union, that was the same day that he had that famous photograph with Matthew Brady took of him. And Lincoln always said that the Cooper Institute and Matthew Brady made him president. You can see on this paper, on this slide, and one of Peter Cooper's campaign ads when he ran for president. He ran against the national banks, among other things. He was an anti-monopolist, and his work with Cooper Union and the sort of the proselytizing that he did inspired Cornell and Vassar and Carnegie and Vanderbilt to also start institutions of higher education. So a lot of what we think of as higher education in the United States flows back to Peter Cooper. So I sort of view him as one of the heroes of this saga. Then there's Shirley Chisholm, CUNY's own Shirley Chisholm. She graduated from Brooklyn College. She had a double major in Spanish and sociology. And she was a force to be reckoned with. She ran for the state legislature in the 1950s over the objection of party bosses. And when she won, she really was a very well-respected state representative. Her most important legacy from that time in the New York legislature is the Sikh program. She helped create it. And in fact, Brooklyn College was one of the first institutions of higher learning to participate in the Sikh program. And it's still around, and it still provides access to underserved young people to allow them to access higher education. In 1968, as part of the Voting Rights Act, New York had to redistrict because the districts were deemed to be racially discriminatory. And again, over the objection of party bosses, Shirley Chisholm ran. The party bosses had really coalesced around James Farmer, who was a former freedom rider, as their candidate. And he was very dismissive of her. He called her the little school teacher, and a lot of his campaign rhetoric was about how we needed a man's voice in Congress. And in fact, the New York Times, when they wrote about this race, they called it a race between Farmer and a woman. They didn't even bother to use her name. But she won in a landslide victory, and then really shook Congress to its foundations. She started making waves the moment she walked in the door. She was a powerful advocate for civil rights, for the rights of Black Americans, for women, ran for president in 1972. She was the first Black woman to run for president. She was the first Black person to run on a major party platform and the second woman to do so. And throughout the 1970s, Gallup polls repeatedly showed that she was one of the 10 most respected women in America. Again, another hero. In 2019, the Shirley Chisholm State Park opened, and there will soon be a 30-foot tall statue in her honor in Brooklyn in Prospect Park. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say about both of them, but I'm not going to, because I'm trying to keep this short. Let me tell you about a few of the rogues. Now, I'm not exactly sure where the line is between rogue and villain, but for purposes of this conversation, we will talk about this. Oh, one thing I forgot to say about Peter Cooper is that he lived through 21 presidential administrations. He was born when George Washington was president, and he died in the Chester Arthur administration, beating out William Cullen Bryant, who lived through 19 presidential administrations. So anyway, on to rogues. Robert Van Wyck, the Van Wyck Expressway, or I should say Van Wyck, I suppose. That's technically the proper pronunciation, but oh well. So he was the first mayor of unified Greater New York after the 1898 merger, and he had an administration that the New York Times described as mired in black ooze and slime. He was involved in multiple scandals. These political cartoons from Puck show you some of them. The Ice Trust scandal was the one that really sort of set the tone for his administration. American Ice, which was a trust, this was before the Trust Busters, monopolized the ice supply in New York City. And at the same time, American Ice also got the exclusive right to unload ice at New York City's docks. Somehow, at that same time, Van Wyck obtained 5,000 shares of American Ice without paying for them. At the time, they were worth about $680,000, which is roughly $12 million today. And after getting those shares, Van Wyck vetoed legislation that would have increased dock space to allow for competition in the ice market. And the New York Times described this as a trail of rottenness. He also was involved in a second scandal called the Ramapo water steal. And that was a no-bid contract with the Ramapo Water Company. It was a 40-year, $5 million contract to buy water at twice the going rate. There were just a couple of problems. First of all, it was a fake company. Second of all, the rate was extortionate. And third of all, the city already had enough water. And in fact, one of the primary motivating forces for Brooklyn and Queens to join with Manhattan to form the city of Greater New York was to get access to Manhattan's water supply, because Manhattan had excellent water supply through the Croton Aqueduct. So This sparked a second legislative investigation. The Ice Trust scandal had sparked a New York legislative investigation of Van Wyck's mayoralty. And the New York Times described this one as a bold and infamous scheme of pillage. And then a police scandal rounded off his time as mayor. He appointed Bill Devery as his police chief. Devery was indicted for blackmail, extortion, and malfeasance, and allegedly under his leadership, the police department controlled graft and chartered vice. The New York State Legislature had to step in again. This time, they removed the police chief because Van Wyck refused to do so. They also recommended that the governor remove Van Wyck as mayor, but Teddy Roosevelt opted not to do that. Van Wyck did not run again, however, and he then moved to Paris as soon as he stepped down from mayor, having made millions of dollars in his short period of time. One interesting thing about Van Wyck, he grew up largely in South Carolina. His family sided with the South during the Civil War, mostly. He was too young. His mother and father moved with him to the North, but his brothers served in the Confederate Army. And his mother's family were slaveholders. They had a plantation with a lot of enslaved people. And in fact, his mother's family name was Maverick. And the word maverick, to mean sort of iconoclast or rebel who doesn't follow the rules, comes from his uncle, Samuel Maverick, who was in Texas. And he had this strategy of not branding his cattle. And, everybody in Texas branded their cattle because their cattle roamed free. But Samuel Maverick didn't. And his strategy was that therefore he could claim that any unbranded cattle was his. And anyway, that's where we get the word maverick. And you might wonder, why is anything named after this guy? He was pretty corrupt, not terribly noteworthy. He was known as one of Tammany Hall's finest, in air quotes, tools. And he presided over New York at a really important time, obviously, at the merging of the cities of Brooklyn and Manhattan to form the greater New York. And it's appropriate that this horrible, always congested road is the one that is named after him. I don't know. All right, so let me tell you about more rogues. The Macomb family. This one really surprised me. Alexander Macomb was a Scottish immigrant. His family came over here lured by the prospect of free land. They didn't realize until they got here that they were expected to be serfs on the land, and didn't go very well. He and his brother left upstate New York and they went out to the Detroit area, where they made a lot of money illegally trading guns and booze to the local Indian tribes. And then during the Revolutionary War, they were war profiteers who made a fortune selling to the British. And they wound up owning vast swaths of land, including all of Grosse Isle, among other places. After the war ended, Alexander came back to New York. His brother stayed in Detroit and actually ultimately became a member of the Canadian Parliament. But Alexander came back, and surprisingly, Nouveau Riche, New York welcomed him with open arms, even though he had been supporting the British in the Revolutionary War. He built a house that became the first residence of George Washington. And he was engaged in a tremendous amount of land speculation. He wound up owning all of the Adirondacks and most of the islands in the St. Lawrence waterway. He bought them for pennies in a land sale that rocked New York as a scandal. DeWitt Clinton and Aaron Burr were both accused of complicity in a scheme to defraud the citizens of New York through this land sale. And at the same time, Alexander Macomb was scheming with William Durr to try to corner the US debt market. And that sparked the Panic of 1783. Macomb wound up losing all of his money. The Adirondacks wound up being sold to try to service his debt. He also owned Bear Mountain, among other places. And after all of that catastrophe, he decided to go to become a miller. And he got a water grant from the city to use the river at Spuyten Duyvil to run his mill. He wasn't very good at that. He was not very good in business. And he lost that in a foreclosure sale. And his son, Robert, his younger son, Robert, wound up buying it. His younger son, Robert, had been forced out as the clerk of court in New York for corruption and was looking for something new to do. So he bought this mill, and he got another water lease from the city. He also got the right from the state legislature to build a dam on the condition that the dam not block navigation on the Harlem River. And so this is what he built. Now think about, this is a time when you've got schooners, masted ships. None of them could get through this, the dam that he built. And it was a huge issue of contention. His grant from the legislature was unambiguous, that he had to either build it so it didn't block navigation, or he had to build a lock. He did neither. He also requested and was denied the right to build a bridge across his dam. And you can see here in the picture, there's a bridge across his dam. So as a lawyer, he sort of didn't really think that complying with the law was something that he had to do, as opposed to, pesky little people having to do. So upstream residents, as you might imagine, were outraged because this dramatically limited their ability to bring their crops to market, to get supplies, etc. And a group of Westchester residents, led by Louis Governor Morris, showed up in a schooner and demanded passage, as was their right, through the lock in the dam. And of course, there wasn't one, so they couldn't pass through it. So what they did was they dismantled part of the dam so that they could pass through it. Robert tried to have them arrested, and the courts refused, saying that the right of free passage in the waters of the United States, this was one of the first cases that identified the waters of the United States, that the right of free passage had been abridged, and in fact wound up ordering Robert to pay the wages of the men that Morris had hired to dismantle the Macomb's Dam. Eventually, it was removed as a nuisance, and this is what Macomb's Dam looks like today. If you're driving up the FDR Drive, you can see another traffic jam, right? Sub-theme of this work is the way that infrastructure creates congestion, particularly infrastructure that has been pitched as a way to eliminate congestion. So let's talk about the villain, and then I promise I'm almost done. The real villain of this piece is Richard Riker. The Riker family, the von Riken family, they were Dutch immigrants. They were a slaveholding family that used enslaved labor to build their own personal wealth that they then parlayed into social and political prominence. Samuel Riker served in both the Continental Congress and in the First Congress. And Andrew Riker was a privateer he was a ship captain. He was a privateer during the War of 1812. And in sort of classic Yankee ingenuity and entrepreneurship, he sold shares in his privateering boats. So you could purchase a share of one of his voyages, and that would entitle you to a percentage of whatever booty and loot he managed to capture in targeting other ships. Richard Riker was the city's recorder, which is the equivalent of a municipal judge. And in that role, one of the things that he did was sign manumission certificates as New York was ending legal slavery. He personally enslaved at least one person. And in his role as recorder, it was his task in the run-up to the Civil War to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. And that was something he did with a vengeance. He not only was very willing to find that people who had liberated themselves from slavery should be sent back to bondage in the South, but he was part of what came to be known as the Kidnapping Club, which was a scheme between him, the police chief, and a couple other high-ranking officials to grab random Black New Yorkers off the street, deny them their right of habeas corpus to prove that they were free New Yorkers and had never been enslaved, and send them into slavery. And it's hard to think of anything more villainous than that. So he really is the villain of the piece. And in many ways, his role in New York City presaged the ongoing discussions that we're having right now about renewable Rikers and about Rikers Island and closing the Rikers Island jail complex. I'm deeply involved in the Renewable Rikers project. So, I think that this part of the history is particularly important. While Black New York viewed Richard Riker as a menace, and in fact, the New York Vigilance Committee sort of named him as one of their biggest enemies. To white New York, he was a courtly, polite, gentlemanly person. There were poems written about him. He was super popular and really well respected in white New York. And if you think about the way that the unconstitutional stop and frisk policy played out in New York, you can see really clear parallels, how Black and brown young men were unconstitutionally targeted and sent at really high rates to Rikers Island as pretrial detainees with, unmeetable bail requirements. Largely, white New York didn't see much of a problem, and I think that that sort of history has the parallels there are, to me at least, are very striking. But I don't want to end with villainy. I want to end on a hopeful note. So I want to end by telling you about somebody who isn't in the book, because nothing is named after her yet. But my hope is that something will be named after her soon. This is a picture of Mayor LaGuardia swearing Jane Matilda Boleyn in to be the first Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. And then for the first 20 years that she served as a judge, she was the only Black woman to serve as a judge in the United States. She was very, very well respected as a judge. She helped reorganize the family courts here in New York and to get rid of a lot of de jure segregation that had been built into those family courts. She was a role model for women judges and Black women judges. In particular, Judith Kay cites her as a role model, and Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman to serve as a federal judge, consulted her about about sort of the role and the process. She was routinely floated as a potential federal or state judge, but she saw her mission here in New York. She really saw her mission as helping kids and working with kids here in New York City. And nothing is named after her. And every year for the past couple of years, Representative Aubrey has introduced a bill to rename the Queens Midtown Tunnel in her honor. I think that should happen, and I'm a big advocate of that. And so I wanted to end on that. And with that, I am going to say thank you very much for listening to me. I encourage you, if you can, check out the really fun book trailer that Queens-based artist Jeff LaGreca made for the book. The YouTube link is there on the screen, and I am glad to answer any questions. Thank you for letting me talk at you, and for listening to me. And I would also say that Naming Gotham is available everywhere books are sold. You can get it from your library. If you are inclined to buy it, I would encourage you, please try to get it from a local bookstore rather than ordering it from Amazon, because we need local bookstores. But yeah, gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fabulous presentation. I seem to be echoing, Mr. Kodat. Can everybody hear me?
I think
So
it's good now. It was,
Yeah.
purely
yeah, I
fun.
mean, I like to think of myself as echoing through the centuries, but not immediately. Um, so I know I have some questions, but I'm here as a moderator, and so I'd be delighted to moderate any questions that there may be from those folks who are logged on. I just wanted to mention that a link to the book website at Arcadia is in the chat box. I too urge you all to go visit local bookstores rather than ordering through Amazon. But you can also order through a publisher if you're an online sort of person. And so that's what we generally recommend. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry, my video went out for a moment. It seems to be a day for all right. I tell you what, I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about renewable Rikers. I was reading about that when I was checking out your background to introduce you, and it certainly looked like something of great interest. So could you say a little bit more about what that project is trying to accomplish?
I would love to. So Renewable Rikers is a plan for what happens to the island after the jail shuts down in 2027. By law, the jail has to shut down in 2027, and that leaves 413 acres. By the way, I should also add that the original island, when the Von Riken family owned it, was 89 acres. And New York City bought the island in the 1890s, and the plan was to build it out and reclaim the shoals. And what they did was they took coal waste from Manhattan and dumped it into the East River to build the island. And they used prison labor to do it. And this was pitched as a win-win-win for the city, because the city would no longer have to pay to dispose of its coal waste. The city wouldn't have to pay the labor for doing this work and would get a bigger island that they could then use to build a jail. The island is toxic. What the jail itself is toxic. 89% of the people who are held there are pretrial detainees. Anyway, the people have been convicted of nothing. The jail has to close in 2027. And afterwards, the plan is to use it as a place for solar energy generation and battery storage and wastewater treatment. And the idea is to move this sort of these locally undesirable land uses, this polluting infrastructure, out of the communities that were most overburdened by mass incarceration on Rikers Island. So move these land uses to Rikers Island, taking them out of those communities. The city would have modern facilities, and the communities would have environmental benefits that would be a kind of restorative justice for the trauma that they've gone through associated with Rikers Island. It is city law. There's a trio of laws that were enacted in 2021 that are collectively called renewable Rikers that commit the city to investigating the feasibility of these plans and to creating an advisory committee of people who are justice impacted or were incarcerated on Rikers Island to be a guiding and sort of leading voice in this process. I think it's really exciting. It's an exciting model for environmental justice. It's an exciting model for how to think about reparations and restoration, and it will single-handedly provide half of the CLCPA's target for battery storage in the whole state of New York. So it's like win-win-win.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very, very interesting, and such a nice rebuke to the Rikers legacy. I was struck as I was listening to your talk about sort of the continuity of the Rikers legacy, and I should just tell you that as a specialist on piracy, selling shares in your loot is something that goes all the way back to the period I specialize in, which is medieval Europe. So it's really interesting to see that you have sort of this deep-rooted connection between piracy and coerced labor that's sort of rooted in Rikers Island. It vindicates all of my prejudices as a historian. So do we have other questions from other folks who've logged on? So
Hmm.
yeah, are you thinking about a second book of all the folks you couldn't cover in your first book?
I don't know. I've been writing a lot of blog posts. I wrote, sort of trying to get some of this stuff out of me and into the world. I'm not sure I'm going to write another book. I'm not really a historian. I have a lot of other work that I need to do, but I do love learning about New York City. And I think that this is a really human way into the history of the city, like learning about who Archibald Gracie was and his role in starting the New York Post, his close relationship with Alexander Hamilton, just sort of as an example, and the way that enslaved labor built Gracie Mansion. I feel like that gives a different kind of a texture to history and makes it more accessible and more human and also a lot more interesting. Or like the idea of the Bruckner Expressway is named after Henry Bruckner, who was the very corrupt Bronx Borough president during the same era that Deegan was tenement commissioner. And before he went into politics, again under the Tammany auspices, he had a soda company. And during Prohibition, he made a fortune selling soft drinks. And in fact, he's probably the only political figure in US history that has been protested by a march of young people demanding that he lower the cost of ice cream sodas. They picketed him at City Hall. He was caught up in the Seabury investigation, the same one that brought down Mayor Walker for corruption. He was not removed for corruption, but he did sort of get hauled over the coals. He and his son had visited, they had about 11, I forget the exact number. He had quite a few safety deposit boxes that they visited more than 500 times over a couple of year period. And there were hundreds of thousands of dollars apparently involved. Interestingly, actually, he was one of those civil servants who was not at his job very much. He liked to travel and he often left the Bronx in the care of Flynn, who was his deputy president. And he suffered from what they called sleeping sickness at the time. And when I started doing this research, I had no idea what that was. It sounded so strange to me. But I come to find out that it was one of the lingering side effects of the 1918 flu pandemic. So as we talk about long COVID, after the COVID-19 pandemic, after maybe is not quite the right word to use, but that's what, those kinds of lingering effects happened after the flu pandemic as well. We just didn't know about it or talk about it. And instead people would say, oh, he's got sleeping sickness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very, very sort of interesting set of connections. I did want to mention that while you say you're not a historian, the Association of Public Historians of New York gave you an award for this book. So,
That's true.
yeah, so right. So and I would only add that when the New York Court Historical Association does presentations from their archives, there's often a great deal of crossover, particularly in illuminating the sort of the odd role that New York played as a slave state and as a transit area for people who were trying to get out of slavery, so that there was an abolitionist community, but there were also folks who were deeply invested in keeping slavery going. We
Yeah.
have a chat question, which from Mr. Stephen Rush. He asks, how the heck did they then need the expressway after Van Wyck? Why did they call it an expressway?
Expressway is in New York tends to be a euphemism for parking lot.
Sorry.
A lot of rappers have written about the Major Deegan, and they tend to ride Major Deegan with Speedin', mostly because standing still in traffic doesn't rhyme. But so expressways and parkways are structurally different kinds of roads. And this again dates back to Robert Moses and his vision for for remaking the city in his image. Expressways were designed to move people through on their way somewhere else. And so you think about the Cross Bronx Expressway that was sort of forced through the Bronx, and then the Major Deegan Expressway and the Bruckner Expressway. Right? Those were all about moving people in and out of the city from other places. The parkways, on the other hand, were designed originally for more recreational driving, and that's why they're really beautiful. They're also sort of a bit of a challenge for modern navigation because they're too narrow, and they don't meet federal highway standards, which is why they're constantly being updated. So anyway, the expressway has to do with the standards to which the Van Wyck was built and its role, which was in theory to move people. Moses pitched it as it will make driving to Idlewild Airport, because it wasn't JFK yet, a pleasure. And I don't know what his version of pleasure was, but I can't imagine that anybody who has to take the Van Wyck Expressway feels that way about it. When it was opened, the sanitation band presented the music at the celebration, which I don't know, seems somehow appropriate.
Well, certainly, if not, prescient, certainly. But it wouldn't be it wouldn't be the only thing that Moses was wrong about.
That is
and
true.
so I'm wondering, I'm not a specialist in American history, but I'm wondering, in the
Neither
course
am
of,
I.
but I mean, in the course of writing this book, did you find any connections to your general work in environmental history? I mean, I noticed your reference to the waterways legislation. Were there other things that you found that were a kind of a connect to an earlier consciousness about preserving the environment, or
not?
not?
So
Yes.
the way that the Cross Bronx Expressway was built through the Soundview neighborhood of the Bronx is sort of a textbook example of environmental injustice. And so, a lot of my work has to do with air pollution, and it's about air pollution associated with highways and airports, among other things, and other kinds of polluting infrastructure, and how that burdens communities of color and poor communities in New York City and across the country and around the world. So yes, there are a lot of connections. And, I also feel like it's all really, everything you learn is grist for the mill. Whatever you look at makes you sort of brings a new layer to your own work. So even though, like I said, I have trouble staying in my lane, I can make comic books, I write history, and I do environmental law and property law. I do think that the connections are there. They're very obvious. The same populations that were overburdened with terrible working conditions are the same populations today that are environmental justice communities. And the communities that were forced off their land to make a lot of this infrastructure are the same communities today that are facing gentrification, or are being over-policed, or are disproportionately exposed to pollution.
Do we have, we have a second follow-up question from Mr. Rush. He wants to know why they named it Van Wyck. Whose idea was it? Who was stumping for this?
That was Robert Moses. That was his decision, and his attitude was, I can do whatever I want. I'm Robert Moses. And in fact, when he was deciding that this was going to be named for Van Wyck, people pointed out to him, well, it's really Van Wyck. And his response was, I can call it whatever I want. When he was building the Van Wyck Expressway, though, advisors begged him to either add light rail or to acquire the right of way for light rail. And he said no, because he was not a believer in public transit. He, in fact, didn't want people to be able to access the airport if they couldn't drive there.
Well, that's consistent with his
Yes.
position on so many other things.
On so many other things. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, and I can recommend, there's the wonderful book on Robert Moses, if this is something that anyone wants to follow up. And I believe it was recently made into a play or a movie.
It was a movie. It was a play and a movie. It's The Power Broker.
The Power Broker.
Highly recommended if you feel like reading a really long book. It's a great book, but it is really long.
Well, historians.
But even for historians, that's a particularly long book.
Are there other questions? Yes, Ryan Walsh, please.
Sure, I have one. Hey. Don't mind. I have my camera off. I keep getting a message that says I'm unstable, and I'm not sure if it's the computer or me. But it's not a fully formed thought. But my background's in preservation, and I think about in New York City how the landmarks that have been chosen over the course of history and that we currently talk about largely reflect one aspect. Typically white privilege history in telling the history of New York. And I think it's an issue when we're talking about preservation. And I kind of see maybe a parallel in how the names are chosen or who is chosen to be represented. And I know at the end, you mentioned that there's a campaign to be more inclusive, but I'm wondering if you talk about that in your book, kind of whether like the disproportionate number of white men that are,
yes,
whose names are used. Sorry, totally unformed in my head.
No, it's a really good point, though, and thank you for teeing it up for me. Because one of the things that I try to grapple with in the book that I think we all have to grapple with is that who gets to decide what counts as history and whose lives mattered and continue to matter is very gendered and very racialized. And that, as that is changing, we are really being forced to think differently about our history. So I make a real point of trying to point out all of the people that things are named after here in New York who were enslavers, who profited from enslaved labor. And I also try to make a point of how many of the people that things are named after here in New York had relatives who were in committed single-sex relationships throughout history. And, that part of history is so typically erased, but that is the reality of what it means to be human, is that, we're all here together, and it's not, these questions are not new. They have been around forever. And as long as there have been people, there have been gay people. And that, I'm trying to recapture those parts of history in this writing. I also tried to really sort of emphasize people like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was the first Black man elected to Congress. And, Shirley Chisholm doesn't need much in the way of emphasis because she was the it woman a couple of years ago, and pretty much, her story is pretty well known now. But there are a lot of, in telling the stories of these men, I was trying very hard to not only tell their stories because they're people and they're interesting, but to spread out whose lives, were part of this conversation, and how much New York is a product of all of us together being here building it.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for asking that.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. Are there other questions? Well, um, if there are none, I know that we've got on the chat box, Mr. Kodat, our technical advisor, has been kind enough to put the YouTube link to the video that you might enjoy. I
It's
assume this,
funny.
yes, I'm
I
sure
encourage
it
people
is.
to read it. It's funny.
I
I
assume
mean,
your
watch it.
book is on sale at our two local Long Island City bookstores on 36th and down below the bridge at Book Culture. Uh,
Yeah, it's at Astoria Books.
uh-huh. Uh-huh. So we have local representation for our small bookstores. And then there are small bookstores that you can find in, I'm sure, in Manhattan and in Brooklyn that will also carry it. It sounds like a fascinating, fun read. And I'd like to thank you so much for taking us through it this afternoon. And I'd like to thank you all for attending this new entry in the book talk series for the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming. I see a bunch of my students, so thank you.